Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependent Dummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. Now, in your 20s, you're finding yourself exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in shit relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. Codependency is a way of being where we put the feelings, wants, and needs of others above our own in an unconscious attempt to meet our own feelings, wants, and needs. Sorry to break it to you, sis, but that is not sustainable. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Codependency podcast. Today, I'm sitting with Meredith Blumenthal. Meredith is a registered dietitian nutritionist specializing in nutrition therapy for individuals struggling with food and body image concerns. She owns an all-virtual private practice where she helps clients get to the roots of their unhealthy relationships with food and movement and reclaim trust in their bodies. Meredith considers herself an anti-diet dietitian and helps individuals understand how dieting is harmful to their mental and physical well-being and how to honor their body's true desires without depriving themselves of the foods they love or jeopardizing their physical health. Meredith, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Marissa. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. All right, well, we'll start with our typical two. So first, Meredith, I'm curious, how do you conceptualize codependency?
Yeah. So I would say my definition of codependency, because I'm a dietitian and not a therapist, is really kind of coming from my lived experience and pop culture. So for myself, I would say codependency has really showed up in, romantic relationships, friendships, parental relationships with supervisors, instructors, even my therapist at times. Mm-hmm. And I think the way that shows up for me can be, just that general, like, valuing the approval of others more than I'm valuing myself.
Right.
Or often like putting my, or the emotional needs of others before my own needs.
Right.
Which, makes it even kind of difficult to identify what my needs might actually be, to sort of feel like a sense of safety and belonging and connection. I think, it can also show up as just emotionally relying on like external sources for self-validation. Mm-hmm. Things like saying yes to everything, from, work requests to social engagements, or, providing that ear to a friend who's needing emotional support, when it would really just serve me better to rest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm curious to hear more on external forces. I might have heard it wrong, but external forces for validation. What does that look like?
Yeah, external sources for validation. Yeah.
Forces.
I mean, same thing, right?
Same thing.
So I think, another good way to kind of explain that concept would be just to share an example from my own life. Mm-hmm. And I think it really can come up a lot for folks that are struggling with food and body images, and, relationship with food, etc. I think, it's in our culture, we have this ideal that, you know, female presenting people are, quote, supposed to live up to, you know, being in a smaller body,
right,
certain, you know, features, presenting themselves a certain way in the world physically. And I think, at least in my experience, I have had points in my life where I am actually relying on, you know, I'm constantly seeking that feedback from others about how I'm physically presenting to them, to the world, from anything like, oh, I wonder if they think, you know, my outfit is cute today or whatever, you know, it sounds so superficial, but that to like, you know, do they think I'm a physically attractive person? It's even like, you know, I'm noticing shame kind of coming up, sharing that, because I think it's a human experience, and there's this double-edged sword. Like, we all at some point care how other people experience us physically. That's a normal human thing. And also to say that out loud is, you know, like, quote, bad in our culture, because it's might, you know, signal that we're like a shallow person, or, you know, on and on and on.
when in fact you're hyper focused on others, right? It sounds self-centered, sounds self-involved. Oh, yeah. I wonder if they think I'm cute in this outfit. But the emphasis is really on, I wonder if they like, you're focused on them.
Exactly. And, you know, I think it comes back around to, again, trying to get those needs satisfied, right? I know for me, one of my major needs in life is connecting with others. And so I want that acceptance, right? So that it makes sense that in order to feel accepted, you know, one might be concerned about, like, oh, what do they think of me? Like, how do they think I'm presenting? And yeah.
I'm wondering, Meredith, if a specific memory, experience, relationship comes to mind where you were focused on these external sources for validation through your body.
Yeah. I would say a large portion of my childhood. And I think, you know, what comes to mind when I think of that specifically is I remember going to the store, like the grocery store, with my mom. I must have been, I don't know, probably between the ages of, you know, 5 and 10. So a significant number of years. And people would always come up to her and say, oh, is this your daughter? Like, oh my gosh, she's so beautiful. And, you know, make comments about my hair, like, oh, wow, like her hair is so beautiful. And I really internalized that and made that my identity, right? And yeah, looking back on it, it wasn't like anything wrong that, you know, my mom did specifically, or, you know, it's very normal in our culture to make comments about people's appearance and bodies. But it really solidified this self view of needing to be that way in the world and needing to receive that validation. And if that validation wasn't there, there must be something wrong with me.
Yeah. Right. Because, well, the takeaway as a 5-year-old, I sense conclude, because I'm presenting like this, right? I am being approached I'm not only like, I don't know, like just being cordial. Like people are like really connecting with me, right? Like people are really attracted, like magnetic. Like I am like pulling people towards me, connection wise, as a consequence to, oh, how beautiful my hair is, or oh, how beautiful I am, right? And then making that a universal rule. Yeah, then you're just required, right? Part of you senses you're required to do that forever.
Yeah. I mean, I was a child still developing. And I think, I've never thought about it in that way, that like people were sort of pulled toward me. But, in light of that, I was also a pretty shy kid. So I think that adds a whole nother layer of, like, not really being seen if that validation isn't happening, if those people aren't, magnetized toward me and making those comments. And yeah, I had a rough next phase of life when I hit puberty and my body changed and all that stuff. So
right, so it's twofold. You're understandably hesitant, reluctant to approach people to connect with them, and then based on your appearance, you potentially override that, like, oh, thankfully I don't have to be the one to start a conversation or approach or whatever, initiate. And yet if they're not coming towards you, you're more hesitant to reach out or connect, and then then you're really lonely if nobody approaches you.
Exactly. And then, remember what I said, one of my core values is and needs is, as a person in the world, is connection. And it's just, it was that much more isolating.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of, I mean, I know we'll get into this later, but a lot of these themes, I think, really like these themes of loneliness and isolation. And I work with a lot of folks that have diagnosed eating disorders. A lot of those themes show up with my clients. And it just makes a lot of sense when I reflect on my own personal journey.
Yeah, I have a mentor, and recently she and I were talking about body image, and I articulated that in the past, my body was my ticket to other people. I couldn't access them without here's my admission, here's my ticket. And so now it's a whole new world, trying to skip the admission process and just access, or walk up, approach, connect with people. I live my life based on my body, my appearance, my exterior as my ticket to connecting with you. And if it's not presentable, pleasing, meeting the cultural ideal for being small, then I have no ticket. I have no chance, no possibility, no opportunity to connect with you.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think if, when we go even wider, like your personal experience, which, I can so relate to, as I just shared, like if we zoom out and think about, female presenting folks' experience in, we'll just say the United States, because I don't know what it's like to live anywhere else. Generally speaking, like in this patriarchal society, this is an epidemic that is happening, right? It's not just your individual experience. And it takes a lot of unlearning that conditioning to like get past it and like choose a different way of being in the world. And that's, I think, kind of relates back to that, the codependency piece and some of the things, I've heard you speak about in the podcast before. And yeah, it's a bigger issue.
Yeah. All right. Well, continuing with that bigger issue, we've already started to discuss this, and I'm also wondering, how do you sense codependency relates to food and body concerns? And then, I wrote, if we are so focused on the needs of everyone else, right, needing to please them, being objectified, what happens to our needs for comfort, physical nourishment, pleasure?
Exactly. They do not exist. I think, when I think about, like, I'll just say that, I view eating disorders as a spectrum, just like I view depression or anxiety as a spectrum, or any other, mental concern that we struggle with as humans.
Codependency.
Yep, exactly. And so you have, on one end, a diagnosable eating disorder that is completely disrupting your life and you can't function and it's impacting everyone around you, and et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other end, you have just this like I would just call it like disordered eating. And that very much is normalized in our culture. And so I think, in reference to what happens to our needs, I think depends on where we are on that spectrum. So someone who has maybe disordered eating might, 50% of the time put someone else's needs above their own needs for, connection, nourishment, experiencing pleasure with food. But somebody with an eating disorder, like a full-blown diagnosed eating disorder, might do that 100% of the time. And it becomes this like snowball effect almost. So the more we ignore our needs, the harder it becomes to acknowledge our needs.
Right.
I think I answered your question.
Other ways you sense codependency relates to food and body concerns?
That's a really good question. I think, we kind of talked about this. I kind of talked around this a little bit, but we can use dieting or eating disorders as like a coping tool, or we can use it as a protective tool. So kind of like we talked before, we diet because we think others will like us more if we're thinner, or we do it so, we feel like we're being better people because we're seeking to be healthy, which is, this is all in quotes, which is, seen as a positive moral value in our culture.
Right.
And, even sometimes I think sometimes people with eating disorders, like diagnosed eating disorders, depend on their eating disorder to avoid feeling painful emotions. Or it can be in response to trauma, right? Or it can be in response to like needing to feel a sense of achievement. Or it can also be like to self-punish.
Mm-hmm.
So I think all of these ways are, adjacent to or kind of versions of codependency showing up in that relationship between how we're choosing to nourish ourselves and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think one other thing I definitely want to make sure to mention is that while it doesn't matter what body size you're in, you can struggle with disordered eating or a full-blown eating disorder. And I want to note that, sometimes people in larger bodies are actually dieting to avoid being treated poorly, which is heartbreaking, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a nutshell, we can call that weight bias. They're experiencing anti-fat attitudes if they identify as a fat person, because our society and individual people, like our society as a whole, institutionally, and individuals treat people who are in larger bodies poorly.
Mm-hmm.
And that can look anything like congratulating someone who's in a larger body that's like out on the street running and saying like, oh, good job. And, it's like, it's coming from a good place from the person who's saying it, who is always in a smaller body. And it's also, it's so shamey and it makes so much assumptions about that person. So there's something sort of as quote benign, which I don't see benign at all, but as that, to like actually, watching somebody in a larger body eat a hamburger in public and having judgments about them.
Mm-hmm.
Like they feel that,
Right.
and then in the institutional sense, like there are literally spaces in the world that don't fit people in larger bodies comfortably, like airplane seats and school desks and, chairs, even in medical clinics,
Right.
waiting rooms. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that because that's a really important part of the work that I do, is
Mm-hmm.
advocating against that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You say more about codependency and dieting or developing an eating disorder as a coping or protective tool.
Yeah. So coping tool, I think, one example I gave was really, a lot of clients have shared that when they restrict their food intake, they feel less emotions. So it's a way that they try and deal with avoiding experiencing difficult emotions.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a big one that I see. And I think, as a protective tool, kind of in the same vein, we might use restriction to, not as an excuse, but I think what happens with eating disorders is that we become more and more preoccupied with what we're eating and how much we're eating and how other people think and feel about what we're eating. And that often leads folks to choose to not engage in social activities where there's food, like turning down an invitation for dinner with friends. And, if we dig a little bit deeper, maybe that is related to social anxiety on some level, right? Maybe it's, the person who's struggling is listening to the eating disorder and maybe doesn't have insight at that time that the eating disorder is actually functioning to keep them out of social situations that feel threatening in some way.
Right.
And I want to caveat that this is not like everyone's experience, right? This is just one thing, like one way eating disorders can show up. Yeah, it's different for everyone.
It is. Yeah. And yet, as you're talking, Meredith, I know a lot of the young women I've worked with, I sense a lot of the women who listen to the podcast, they at times, or sometimes it's like temporary, or it is just this like long continuation of this intersection between wanting to please, wanting the approval, the favor of others, and like that manifesting in thoughts or ruminating on how their body plays into that. And if I'm so focused on others and wanting to please them and avoid conflict and avoid anger and ensure their love for me, right, that can be so exhausting. That like one potential way to cope with that, all the intense emotions or anxiety, maybe I could restrict. Like, ooh, like this feels good to just kind of like shut it down. Like, let me restrict. Or vice versa, like not vice versa, or the opposite, like I could binge and shut it down. Right. And then, again, like what relationships like can mean to me, which for codependence, I think in the depths of it could be my survival. If I'm so anxious about my survival, depending on the approval of others, maybe I'll just start to fixate on my body or my food, and then I don't know, it's a stretch, but then like not go to as many places. Or what are your thoughts as I say all that?
No, I don't think it's a stretch at all. I think what ends up happening for a lot of folks, whether they're aware of it or not, is this sort of living by this rule book, if you will, of needing to please others, and using those rules as a way to govern like how you're presenting physically. So how much you're going to eat and how much you're going to exercise and clothes you're going to wear, and, really hyper focusing on that body image. It's kind of goes back to what I shared about my own experiences, that the goal is to do that because we long to connect with
Right.
others. We long to be accepted. We want to feel safe. We want to feel emotionally connected and in community. And what happens is it does the opposite. It further isolates us because we're so hyper focused on, ourselves in this, like, not in a healthy way, right? Like in a sacrificial way almost, that, like, how could we even have space to be present, to connect with others? And then on top of that, all of the shame that comes along with having an eating disorder. I always like to say eating disorders thrive in secrecy, right? And so if your eating disorder is your lifeline, if it's your strongest coping tool, and it's, oftentimes kept you safe from actual trauma in the past, or, more trauma experiences, you get more and more married to it, and enmeshed with it as your own identity. And then all of the societal, norms around mental illness come up, and eating disorders. And even if you're not aware that there's that shame there, like really wanting to keep your own behaviors kind of a secret just makes the eating disorder thrive even more, and isolates the person even more. So, I mean, I've even heard, I think it was a psychologist, I don't remember who, but say, like, eating disorders are an illness of, like, social disconnection. And that just really resonated for me, in my clinical experience. Like, I see this over and over and over again with clients. And yeah, it sucks. It really sucks.
What sucks?
Just like, I have the most empathy and compassion, because I know there's that longing for connection, and they're just like burning themselves over and over again instead of actually satisfying that need. Yeah. And it's just like, it's painful. It's painful. Yeah.
You're making me think of my definition of codependency, which is a working definition for the podcast, but the like prioritizing the thoughts, feeling, needs of others above our own in an unconscious attempt to fulfill our thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs, right? So it's this backwards effort to feel safe, to feel connected, to feel loved through others. And yeah, similarly with, developing an eating disorder, disordered eating, trying to, at least for those who, maybe struggle with aspects of codependency, start to sense like, oh, like if I am pleasing to others, if I do meet certain cultural standards, I will get the approval of others. I will get the love. But then, it just turns into, like you said, like it ends up doing the opposite. And so that ticket, my admission, I'm so focused on getting the admission that that's all I focus on. And then there's no connection, and even less connection, and disconnection,
and way less room to even explore like what other needs I might have
Mm.
in the world, right? Like a need for pleasure, like physical pleasure, excuse me, a need to, I don't know, like move your body and experience that like feeling of being embodied. There are other needs that we have that I think just get more cast aside when we're so hyper focused and preoccupied with food and body concerns. One thing that came to mind when you were talking was that, I again, it's makes me sad to say this, but typically folks who are in larger bodies and do lose weight, whether it's sort of their first diet or they have a full-blown eating disorder, it's accepted in our culture because they started in a body that is larger than quote acceptable. And so they actually are receiving that validation and that feedback. Wow, you look so great. Wow, like you lost weight, you look amazing. Like,
right, they're approached. They're you in the supermarket. Wow, right? So again, I'm magnetic, I'm attractive, I'm so beautiful, and people are coming to me to connect.
yep. Mm-hmm. And if we put that in the context of this person potentially, experiencing the opposite for most of their life, people glaring at them or, doctors, they go into the clinic for a sore throat and the first thing the doctor says is you need to lose weight. Like, well, what does that have to do with my sore throat? Experiencing that weight stigma and discrimination over and over and over again. Like, yeah, no wonder these folks get full-blown eating disorders. Like, our culture is just, a lot of people unknowingly just making it worse. And since this is a podcast, I do feel like I need to acknowledge that, I'm speaking about all of this from, the privilege of being in a smaller body. So I don't know what it's like to live in a larger body. And I'm using experiences that I've, heard from other professionals who practice that are in a larger body and research that I've read and, clients that I've worked with. So in case not everyone is watching this video of our conversation, I wanted to just name that for the audience too.
I'm wondering, right, the typical codependent arc is I put the thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs of another above my own. I sustain that for a certain amount of time, maybe a lifetime, who knows? And I also am met with resentment, lack of fulfillment, feeling like I'm being taken for granted, etc., in a relationship. And ultimately, my needs aren't met, even though I've really tried to meet them through fulfilling someone else's needs. Right, there's the arc. What have you observed with your clients who have, really, really done their utmost to be smaller, right? To meet the needs of others, like being objectified, like meeting the ideal or meeting the expectations of what's healthy. Yeah, what's happened? Are they happy?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because this came to mind earlier and then somehow it disappeared from my mind again. But I will tell you, every single client that I've worked with that says to me, I worked in higher level of care eating disorder treatment for some time. And so I would work with folks who were actively weight restoring. And, after they weight restored a little bit.
Meaning they're restoring their body to a sustainable,
biologically appropriate weight is what is the term that I would use. So as they've, gained some weight, inevitably body image tanks. And a lot of the comments are like, I just was so much I was so much happier when I was in a smaller body. And when you start to dig a little bit deeper with clients on that statement, 100% of the time, they realize that that's not actually true. They aren't actually fulfilled. They still hate themselves. They still don't feel, good enough. They still it's a never ending goal. Like the goalpost keeps moving. And that's what's so frustrating about eating disorders. It's like, okay, well, I got to my quote goal weight. And now, well, this isn't enough. I could always do more. It's that sort of snowball effect. And once you start to get curious about their actual experience, they're like, yeah, I guess you're right. I guess I wasn't happy at that weight either. Every time. I've not had one client that hasn't come to that question or, made that statement, and then me get curious with them and them come to that conclusion that, actually, even though I was X number of pounds, smaller, I still was miserable. It didn't, quote, fix my problem.
Right.
Yeah.
And it didn't ultimately give me the connection, right? We're projecting, but we sense they're looking for a connection. It didn't deliver that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the connection piece is interesting because I think that's a piece that I experience more as a clinician, kind of in the earlier stages of the eating disorder treatment than the client themselves. It usually takes quite a long time for the client to really understand and see how their eating disorder is isolating them and see how that's not actually serving them. And that goes partly back to nutrition, right? Like when we're underfed, our brains actually don't work properly. Our brain feeds on glucose, and glucose comes from carbohydrates. And if we're not getting enough of it, we actually, can have difficulty forming thoughts and have issues with memory and, all of those things. Yeah. So it's funny. I'm a dietitian and I feel like I do so much counseling in my work with clients. But it's, there's the nutrition piece too. That's huge.
Right. And I'm hearing about the experience of those underweight needing weight restoration. And on the opposite end, it is in the zeitgeist that most people who have lost weight, who are approached by others, are praised, are accepted as a consequence to them meeting the ideal. There's usually a ... after the weight loss. And there are stories and experiences of emptiness, of gaining the weight back, of moving the goalposts ever like further down. And so again, similarly to like the overall experience of codependency, this effort to meet our needs by meeting the needs of others just doesn't work.
It just doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I also want to say, like, I think I've heard you say this in podcasts before, like, you can't change a behavior overnight, right? It's like, we can't expect that we're going to hear all of this and know all of this and then do all of this, right? It's knowing and actually doing are two very different things. And I like to, like, a big part of the, you know, healing your relationship with your body and food, in my experience, is requires a lot of patience, because you do have to, you know, keep stumbling and then keep getting back up. Like, it doesn't happen overnight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's hard too, I imagine, for me personally to witness, I would say, the myth of the ticket, right? So I do see people lose weight, or I do see women in smaller bodies it seems like they have more favor, or it seems like they have more acceptance. And so again, I like fall for the myth, and I think like, oh, like that's my ticket. I need to make sure I have my ticket, my approving to others, approving of others ticket. And it's like, where's that? Just forget the ticket. Just try and connect with people. It's okay. Like, it's a myth, but again, I think culturally, at least in the US, we are bombarded by that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You reminded me of something that helps me when I find myself like shifting into that mental space, which is something I came up with my therapist. It's just like reminding myself that I personally want to be seen for who I am, not for how I physically, you know, appear in the world. I want to be seen and recognized and heard for the person that I am, despite the vessel that I'm walking through the world in.
How come?
It's a good question. I think it's just like, that's what makes me feel connected to others. And that's what makes me feel in community. And like, it just feels like the vitality of life for me. I can't really, I've never really tried to put words to it, but it's the best way that I know how to be present and grounded and really show up. And I feel it in my body, I think that's another big piece of these, eating disorders, or, struggling with food and body concerns. We become so disconnected from our bodies. It's like the opposite of embodiment. And again, that just becomes more of a barrier to accessing our needs and expressing our needs.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Final thoughts?
Final thoughts. Yeah, I think just want folks to know that even if you've been told that restricting your intake for health reasons, you're doing keto or whatever the fad diet is of the fad diet du jour, to, improve your health, I think I would just urge some self-reflection and really encourage just thinking about why are you imposing these external rules on yourself around your eating habits. And if you need support is there if you're struggling.
Yeah. And if they want your support, Meredith, where can people find you?
Yeah, they can find me on my website, which is www.nutritionwithmeredith.com. Yeah.
And you are currently seeing clients in Washington and California.
Yes, I am licensed in both of those states. I'm all telehealth practice, and hoping to expand my reach in the future.
All right, well, I'll put links to your website in the show notes, and thank you so much for coming on.
Awesome. Thank you, Marissa. It was a pleasure.
All right, everybody, we'll see you next week. Take care. Hey girl, it's Marissa again. I'm not like a regular podcaster, I'm a cool podcaster, right? Thank you for listening and staying till the end. You can find me on Instagram at therapywithmarissa. Email me, marissa@codependummy.com. Check out codependummy.com for more information on the show. And baby girl, a subscribe, rating, and review would be much appreciated. Till next time, I want you to remember, if you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you think that you don't matter, know that you matter to me. I want you to go out there so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. And now, the disclaimer. Girl, this is not therapy, and I am not your therapist. This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, or guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional service. If you want or need a professional, please